Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 20th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. I'm actually on vacation. I guess you could call it. It's a working vacation this week and next, away with the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe in Australia and New Zealand for some conferences down under. I will be back in a couple of weeks, and so I'm pre-recording some of these for your pleasure. So if I get any new patrons in the meantime, I apologize for not giving you a shout out, but as soon as I am back at my desk, I will definitely do so. As I mentioned, the patrons, I, as always, want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download, even today on episode 610. Wow. So this week's top patrons include, let's see, put that in the wrong order. Here we go. Top patrons. They include Chuck Blell, David J. E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so very much. If you are interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Maria Tatar. She's the John L. Loeb Research Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and of Folklore and Mythology, Emerita at Harvard University. That's such a long title. So she is an Emerita Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and of Folklore and Mythology. And among her many books she's published, we're going to be talking about her newest one today. It is called Arachnomania, Spiders and the Cultural Work They Do for Us. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Maria Tatar. Well, Maria, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
I'm excited to talk about your newest book. I think it's important to say that because you've written many books, but your newest book, Arachnomania, Spiders and the Cultural Work They Do for Us. But before we get into our favorite or not so favorite arachnids, I would love to talk to you about your background a little bit. So Germanic languages and literatures and folklore and mythology. You're a professor of these things, Professor Emerita at Harvard University of these things. How does one become a professor of folklore and mythology, for example?
Well, first I have to confess to having academic ADD. I cannot sit still. I can't stay in one place. I have colleagues who study Kafka for their entire lifetime. And I can't do that. And also, I've been around for a long time. So I started out studying German literature with a PhD in that field. And then I was invited to give a talk on the Brothers Grimm. And I realized to my astonishment that no one with a PhD in German literature studied the Grimms. It was just their fairy tales were considered children's literature. It wasn't part of the true and the good and the beautiful. So that got me off and running. And after I gave that talk, where there were about 200 people, as opposed to the 10 people that usually came to academic talks, I thought, that maybe I'm onto something here. And that led me into folklore and, of course, mythology. And it's all part of the great cauldron of story. And these days, we don't stay in one time and place, but folklorists and those who study literature as well move around from one continent to the next and from one era to the next. It's an exciting time.
It's so lovely to hear that somebody has dedicated their career to celebrating and investigating this fundamentally human endeavor. This show has been on the air now for 11 years. I've been doing this. And early on, I really kind of situated it as a hard science show. And most of my guests were physicists or chemists or biologists. And as the years moved on, the show itself evolved into more social justice orientations with more representation and more of a kind of an inclusive conversation around academia and beyond. And I think part of that was my transition from more like hard neuroscience into clinical psychology. And now I have all of these wonderful people who join me on the show from all these different kind of areas of academia. And I love it because I don't know anything about this. Like, obviously, if I thought about it long enough, I would realize that people do this for a living. But it feels so far away from a lot of my exposure. And so I'm so excited to be able to pick your brain today and learn what your career has looked like. Like, what does a professor who, part of the job, if you're in academia at the level of professor or PhD, is to teach, and part of your job is to do scholarship. What is the scholarship of somebody who studies literature and especially studies like mythology and folklore and beyond?
Oh, well, I have to say that, there's my research and my teaching were always entangled,
Mm.
um, because I learned from so much from my students who made me aware of what was dull and what was interesting. I looked at their faces and, you know, I could always tell whether I was going down the right path or whether I was going into terrain that was just totally uninteresting to them. As for scholarship, I suppose, I have to say that I'm an omnivore, and so I love just moving all over the place, all over the map, as I said before, and then digging deep into my
Mm.
training in German taught me that skill of digging deep and taking things to the sixth decimal point in a way and learning the language, learning about the culture. But then being a folklorist, I was sort of liberated from that, and I realized, I could go to China and I could read collections, to be sure they were translations of Chinese fairy tales, and discover the connections with Western analogs. And so scholarship to me is oddly very unsystematic in a way
Mm.
because what I like to do is just have my basket and collect all kinds of things and then sit at my desk. And, you know, there I would say there is a certain amount of solitude that is required, going from the classroom to the desk
Hmm.
and just thinking hard. And I should say, Claude Levi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, taught me that animals are good to think with. And that accounts, I think, for part of my turn to animal studies, because really thinking hard about our world and how we coexist with other beings on the planet.
Mm. It's It's so important, and I wonder, I mean, obviously, you have so many colleagues, and this is the world that you've been steeped in, but for a lot of, people that you meet on the subway, people that you meet in the grocery store, I wonder how many of them realize that there is this rich academic world where people are digging deep into story and how stories shape humanity, and society. I I can't help but ask, like, when you first got into, when you first decided to go to college even and then continue on to graduate school, was it really situated in, like, I just really love to read? Is that what brought you? And do you find that with a lot of your students or your colleagues that most people in this world are just passionate readers?
Well, I confess to being bookish, and, one of the things that I disliked in my childhood was my mother was constantly telling people that I always had my nose in a book,
Mhm.
and, one of the things I discovered it's such an interesting question that you raised because years and decades ago, I decided to teach a course called Fairy Tales in the Culture of Childhood. Uh,
Mm.
And it was tough to get that course past the gatekeepers who were worried that I would have bottom feeders in that course because fairy tales, these sort of these
Oh, yeah.
silly, frivolous
It's not
stories.
serious,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
And of course, I took some of that seriously. But what I discovered when 400 people showed up for the course, I was expecting 15.
Yeah.
The beauty of it was, why did they come to that course? They were passionate readers.
Mm.
And they wanted to go back and look at the stories that they had grown up with and analyze them. Not have the immersive reading experience, but also step back and look at them. Why was this important? What does this story mean?
Mm.
We are Homo significans, not just Homo sapiens, but we are in search of meaning. We engage in these signifying practices. We try to understand w- something about the stories that we tell to each other. And what you said earlier, I mean, stories make the human world,
Mm.
and they also make the world human, and they keep us human, which is something that is more important than ever, I think, in an age of AI and new technologies.
Oh, absolutely. They help us understand ourselves. I think we can't understand ourselves unless we understand how we are situated, how we relate to others, how we relate um to lore. And one thing that I I had to bring up when you were talking about doing this course that's more geared towards the folk tales of our childhood is whenever we take a minute to actually introspect, to not just take what we're reading at face value or say, oh, here is information, I'm going to add it to my
And
prior information, but to sit and go like, that's kind of weird. Why would they word it? Then you start to realize, wow, a lot of folklore is pretty dark. A lot of things kids are exposed to has a lot of depth, and maybe they're interpreting it at a certain level when they're a specific age, but digging deep probably uncovers a lot, doesn't it?
oh, yes, absolutely. The darkness and fairy tales in particular, folklore and lore in general, myths as well. Uh, they are just weird. They're wired for weirdness. And so I always think of that phrase that Churchill used to describe Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma.
Mm,
And sometimes these stories are so minimalist and you're concept, what? First you're asking what's next?
mm.
Because it's often a great story, but then why? And so sometimes fairy tales are called wonder tales, which I think is a beautiful designation because wonder, as Aristotle and Plato taught us, is the beginning of philosophy.
Mm.
And so you start to understand why Einstein is reported to have said, this may be apocryphal, if you want intelligent children, read them fairy tales. If you want more intelligent children, read them more fairy tales because they get you thinking and they also get you in conversation with other people who have heard a similar story and are also perplexed or puzzled and have a different take on the story.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it reminds me of I I never had the opportunity to be exposed to too much literary training beyond my core courses in undergrad, really. But it reminds me a lot of the work that I was lucky enough to do in some of my philosophy and my poetry courses, where you're not just creating, but you're co-creating, and then you're really taking the
Mhm.
time to attempt these, I guess, hermeneutic interpretations. Like, how do I read this in my context? But also, what was the
Right.
zeitgeist at the time? What were they maybe
Right.
trying to say? And how relevant is that to this conversation?
Yes, I love the fact that you use the term hermeneutic because my students loved it when I referred to them as hermeneutes. Uh, they, they were interpreters. They were searching for meaning. They were trying to figure things out. And today, I really think it's so important to emphasize what you just said about the power of story,
Mm,
because we also live in an era that is characterized by a hermeneutics of suspicion. We
mm,
read things and we say, what? We become overly critical in a way,
mhm.
and in an effort to be ideologically correct. But, again, sometimes sometimes that kind of suspicion also gets conversations going. So I'm not completely opposed to it.
I have to admit that, arachnomania, I think, really speaks to me because I do come from a more natural science tradition. And sometimes I
Um,
struggle when I read, maybe less so when I read, but I love that you mentioned this label of wonder stories as opposed to fairy tales or wonder tales. I sometimes struggle with watching fantasy films or getting involved in the world building that's necessary to get lost in fantasy. I find that I struggle to suspend disbelief in those areas as well.
yeah, I hear you completely. I am a huge fan. I've never met a story that I didn't like in one way or another. But I should I'll make one exception to that. I could never get into Lord of the Rings.
Me neither.
That
It's like
that
a
the
whole
fact
thing.
I know, and I thought, well, maybe if I had a lifetime to learn all these, So I'll say I've never met a fairy tale I didn't like, but I have met fantasy books, and also
Mm.
science fiction is a genre that I struggle with
Same.
also.
Same.
But everything else I love and I embrace, and I admire the people who can really get
Mhm.
into these worlds and visualize them, see them. So,
Oh,
yes,
it's yeah, it's interesting. Like there's a point, I guess, where it's too in the uncanny valley and it requires too much cognitive
too
effort.
much.
Yeah. But if it's really fantastic, it's like, oh yeah, it's easy to suspend that disbelief.
Right, and I'm glad I found a kindred spirit, and,
Me
now
too.
that we're in the confessional mode.
I love it. It's true. A lot of people, they don't
Um,
understand that. So I've got to ask then, you mentioned this turn to animals and this turn to, I guess, life, ecology, biology, the way that we are situated amongst all of the living creatures, all of the organisms. What specifically turned you to spiders?
Hi, that is a great question. I ask myself that almost every day. How did that land on spiders? And what you said earlier about connection and relationships, I immediately thought about spiders and the way that they spin webs
Mm,
and all the metaphors that we derive from observing spiders. But the beginning of it was in a book that I wrote some time ago called The Heroine with 1,001 Faces, which looked at the craft of storytelling. And craft, I use that word deliberately because stories were often told in places where chores were carried out, where women sewed, where they mended, where they
mm,
wove, where the spinning rooms, sewing circles, and all of that. And while I was writing that book, Arachne became one of my 1,001 heroines. She led me to spiders because according to Ovid, she was the first spider.
mm.
So forget Darwin. I know you like science. Forget Darwin, forget evolution. Ovid tells us how spiders came into the world. And Arachne is just a young girl, a beautiful young girl known for her weaving. She's also a bit of a show off. So she catches the attention of Minerva or Athena, who challenges her to a weaving contest. And this is why Arachne became my heroine. That is, she creates this tapestry in which she weaves all of the misdeeds of the gods. And we get Zeus's sexual assaults, the rape of Europa, the seduction of Leda, the deception of Alcmena, and so on. And while Athena is glorifying the gods in her tapestry, Athena is so outraged by this that uh, she tears Arachne's tapestry into pieces, hits her over the head with a spindle, and then Arachne is ashamed and plans to hang herself. But at the last moment, Athena turns her into a spider.
Mm.
But she's now destined. She can no longer be a show off. She's destined to spin in dark corners. But what I found so fascinating about Arachne is one, she speaks truth to power.
Hmm.
With the craft, not with her voice, but with her tapestry, with images. She creates a textile and also a text. And then she creates a thing of beauty. So to me, what resonated with me was this sort of entanglement of both beauty and justice in our storytelling practices in general. And so this is how she became my heroine, and then she led me to all of these other fascinating spiders in not just in literature but in mythology. There's Anansi, the African trickster god, who is also a master linguist and storyteller. And then there's the Navajo grandmother spider, who creates the world by weaving,
Mm.
not by saying, let there be light, or using, words, naming things. But she does this with the sky god. And I love these parent mythologies where you have a male and a female god,
Hmm.
goddess, creating the world. And then by, this wonderful act of weaving, creating fabrics, these protective materials. And if Freud once said that weaving was the only contribution that women made to civilization, which, yes, laughable. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
But
Thank
also,
you.
there's a lot of depth behind that.
There's a lot of depth to that. Then if you think of weaving versus tool making, man, the tool maker, and woman, the weaver, well, these women are creating protective coverings, everything from blankets to tents to and so on. So I think Freud, you know, underestimated what women did, but he also underestimated the power of weaving and the importance of that uh, to our culture.
And, I can't help but point to, for the listeners of the show who have been with me for a while, it actually, you don't even have to have been with me for that long because this only dates back to February. But I had an author on this show, an author and research psychologist and knitter um, named
Um,
Nicole Narig, who wrote a book with her own hands, Women Weaving Their Stories. And one of the things that we really dug deep into was this like quintessentially feminist act that has existed throughout a lot of human history where women who were uh they really were in a lot of ways stripped of any sort of voice within the public arena. They were
right.
able to tell their tales through things like, let's say like the biotapestry or these different very famous works of art that very likely it was women who made them and they interjected a lot of women's perspective in this work. And gosh, there's so much crossover there with your spiders who are of course weaving their webs.
Oh, I have to listen to that podcast for sure. And you brought up knitting. One of the sections of my book looks at spinster sleuths, uh, who are often, when you get the physical description of them, and you realize that had to be some sort of awareness that these women all look like spiders. They're wearing black. They've got, and they're knitting. Or, and this connection between knitting and sleuthing. I mean, sleuthing, detective work was one of the things that women could do, where they did
Mhm,
have some agency, although not a voice, as you point out,
mhm,
because who had the voice? The police,
right.
officials, public, the government, judges. And here are these women, knitting, puzzling things out, figuring things out, and staying ahead of the officials who are not very good at solving mysteries and crimes. So these spider women.
I love it, and I love just the etymology. You were talking earlier about your work in German and really digging deep into not just the era, but of course the language itself. I love that this book, of course, it's a book about spiders by you. So this is one of those lovely times when etymology and entomology should not be mixed up, but are both quite relevant. But I think about terms. We weave we tell a yarn or weave a yarn like
Right.
webs
Spin a
are
story.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
stories, they're tales. Do you know where that comes from? Like what that actually dates back to, this idea of the story being a web that was woven?
Oh, well, I think that it actually goes back to the Greeks where
Mm,
sewing and poetry were connected. You sewed words together. And then
mm.
you have, I mean, it's hard to trace this perfectly, but I always think of these spinning rooms and as I said, sewing circles, these places where people gathered and, you know, they were carrying out household chores. I mean, knitting, you have to have something else there, just like the cigar rollers who
Mhm.
listen to novels, who have novels read to them. When you have work that is repetitive, you desperately need a good story. And
Yeah.
remember, 19th, 18th, 19th century, earlier times, no electronic entertainments, long, dark evenings. So you needed really peppy, melodramatic, racy stories to keep things going. And that's what, we do refer to spinning tales, spinning yarns, weaving webs. And then, I mean, we could even take it up to the World Wide Web
Oh,
and
right.
the way that many women were involved in the beginnings of uh, well, not just but, just the computer in general, and programming and that kind of thing.
How much has your work throughout your career been interested in the social justice components of stories? Maybe, a feminist perspective or an intersectional perspective. I know that you've written about Weimar Germany. You've written about these very kind of um, of their time, before their time experiences that individuals were
Right.
having. And I'm
Yeah.
curious how much that your own, I guess, feminism or femininity has driven some of the stories that you like to dig deep into.
Yeah, my own feminism, and also I think I learned a lot. Here's a point at which I learned a lot from my students
Mm.
who were ahead of me in terms of thinking about issues of social justice. And I had always framed it when I was studying fairy tales many years ago, I suppose in the 80s and 90s. I'd always framed it as getting even. That is, you know, there is kind of naive morality in fairy tales. And, the villains were, goodness was
Yeah.
rewarded, virtue was rewarded, vice was punished, and the scales were balanced out in a way. But over the years, I think, listening to how my students read these stories, I think so much of it is, moving in the direction of fairness.
Mhm.
And I mentioned beauty before. I would love the fact that our English term fairness captures both social justice and beauty. And
Mm.
again, through story, I mean, think about the Me Too movement. I mean, we had our courts, which did not give women justice for
Right.
many, many years. And then we had the courtroom of public opinion. And what was that but sites of storytelling where
Mhm.
women told their stories? And by God, the culture changed. Uh, that was an extraordinary moment, and I think it really tells us a lot about the power of storytelling. And there, I mean, you could say it was a movement also to get even, get revenge in a way, but I don't think that was the driving force. I think it was more, speaking truth to power, getting justice, seeing the other side of the story, discovering that these voices that had not been heard were worth listening to.
Yeah, it reminds me one of my favorite memes online that I come across periodically because clearly the algorithms know what it is I'm looking at. Will say things
Oh,
like men should be happy that women just want equality and we don't want revenge, right? It'd be a very different world we'd be living in if that were the case. Um,
uh,
Speaking though of this very feminist or feminine perspective, I mean, I can't help but point to the feminine of the spider. Like when we think about
uh,
spiders, there's so
right.
much sort of I don't know, analogy. There is so much of it feels so feminine.
Yes, and I think of Stephen King's It.
Hmm.
I don't know whether you've ever read that. It's
Oh, I
about
did when
oh,
I was too
oh,
young, too.
oh,
Yeah, much too
oh
young.
gosh, yeah, yeah. Well, what a blood-curdling story that is. And
Yeah.
the spider, the monster, of course, there's a way in which that story frames monster. What are you afraid of? That's then your monster. You
Mm,
create your own monster. But it, which is everyone's monster, it's female and
mhm.
it's pregnant.
Mhm. Wow.
So, there's something about that that tells us about our fear of not just of women, but of their capacity to give birth, to create,
Mm.
and
Their
in
power.
their
Like the
power.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and trying to unpack that is, a real challenge, I think, to try to understand what is at the heart of that? Why would Stephen King come up with it? And Stephen King is, in many ways very politically correct
Oh,
too,
yeah, yeah.
so when I came to that moment, I thought, "What?" You know? And Stranger Things too, if you
Mhm.
think about the monsters in the it's always Down Under or the I
Oh,
always get the
the upside down. Yeah.
Upside Down, thank you.
Yeah.
I always wanna call it the Down Under for some reason.
It's
Thank
a
you.
yeah,
The
yeah.
the Upside Down, what is in that world? This kind of mass of, it is a little bit like a womb, like going inside a body, and then
Right.
the figure the, carnivorous spider, is, you know oh, well, talk about it is reminiscent of female genitals, I'll just say
Mhm.
it, because
Yeah.
Shalob is the same thing,
Mm,
where, uh, this creature becomes, sort of the most frightening feminine form possible.
right. I can't help I think my own cynicism, or maybe I'm not being cynical, maybe I'm being a realist, but I can't help but, eh see this through the lens of somebody who can't help but see patriarchy all around me and think about the fact that there has been a long history of men clinging to power and preventing women from having said power or having said voice. And I do wonder how much underlies or how much of it is underlying this fear that women have, these ultimate powers. They can create life and I think historically too, because of the positioning of men and women, the normative gender roles, there's this mystique, right? This succubus kind of
Yes,
narrative.
exactly.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
women are going to get
yeah.
inside your head and they're going to like undermine your manhood or whatever.
Oh,
When
yeah.
really, yeah, it's all just been I guess just the activity of women to try to make sure their voices are heard, but it's become monsterfied by the men who told these stories.
Right, right. It sort of is women what is the title of that book from long ago? Is male to culture as female is to nature.
Mm.
The nature
Mhm.
culture divide that
Yeah.
is, with the male being strong, autonomous, self-contained, and the woman, being very much body and biology, reproduction. I mean, you could frame it as production versus reproduction,
Hmm.
creativity versus procreation. And that binary, I think, is something that we really have to worry about
I
because,
agree. Yeah, because it
yeah,
is artificial, right? It is a story in and of
absolutely.
itself.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
And that's such an interesting thing as a person. Like, working as a psychologist, one of the things I've long been grappling with is the idea of constructivism, right? I'm a science based thinker. I'm an evidence based thinker. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in anything supernatural. And yet, eh, although I agree that there is an external reality that we can consensually agree on based on our tools, I also believe that every single person on the planet constructs their own reality from their own experience. They have their own lens. And we all have narrative, right? Stories are codified versions of those narratives, and hopefully with a lot more creativity and wordplay, and hopefully just like with the interest and the pizzazz that keeps us fascinated and wanting to turn the page. But a story about a spider that is either passed down through the ages or is put on the page is in a lot of ways no different than a person's story about their own life, right? Or how they are situated in the timeline of humanity. It's still a story. It's a narrative.
It's a narrative. And what I would say is that in many ways, I mean, even though, I mean, take something like Stephen King's It.
Hmm.
We just talked about how horrifying that scene is. And yet, I would say the importance of the story is the minute I read that, I wanted to go out and talk to somebody about it.
Right.
So the story, everything is constructed in a way, but because we have this context zone
Hmm.
uh, in story, and its story I mean, gives us a symbolic world. But to me, it's also so important that the symbolic helps us navigate the real.
Yeah.
That often we need the story about the spider instead of the human in order to understand ourselves. That is, spiders are in a funny way are significant others, are curved mirrors, are they they tell us something about us. They I always marvel at how fables, for example, I mean, fables, we tell these fables to children about animals, and again, going back to Levi Strauss, animals are good to think with, and
Hmm.
they sort of help us to construct, a symbolic world that helps us understand the real, and getting back to what you said and how the real is also socially constructed.
I'm when I work with my patients, and I work in a large cancer center in a large hospital, and a lot of what we do is logotherapeutic work, right? Meaning focused therapy, life review, trying to understand uh, purpose, trying to understand and live life to the fullest, regardless of what life is left, right? And how much time we have, really grappling
Yeah.
with mortality. Metaphor is so fundamental to the work. There are just, sometimes you just cannot verbalize an emotion or an experience without utilizing the power of metaphor.
I think that's exactly what Levi Strauss was getting at.
Mm,
That it, I always think about it when you ask children, "How was school today? How was that movie? What did you like about the party?" They clam up.
mhm,
They have nothing to say. And then if you start to, just start telling them a story, and
mm,
then you'll see that, I mean, they are uh, myth makers in a way
mhm.
because they pick up bits and pieces of the day, and if I don't mean just tell them the story, but create a story with them,
Mm,
and suddenly you'll start to understand. This is why it's such a two-way. We always think of reading to children or telling children stories. We're teaching them, we're entertaining them, but above all, teaching them. Uh, but it's a two-way street, and we learn a lot about the child and how the mind of a child works. The great mystery. How does the mind of a child work? We learn so much about them through the story, and they need metaphor. I think they may not know
Mhm.
what a metaphor is, but they really need it to be able to open up and talk.
Yeah, and I'd argue that as adults, we're not far off from that either. That child
Exactly.
inside of us, if, especially in a, I mentioned a therapeutic setting because that's sometimes one of the most vulnerable places that we exist. And and yes, metaphor is a huge helper to be able to go into
Yes,
the
right,
depths.
right, right. And what you described just reminded me of my experience with children. And
Mm,
you're right, it's often a crisis situation, an
yeah.
emotional crisis that triggers the need for a story, uh,
Yes.
and the
And that's
need for metaphor. Yeah.
That's probably why so many of these fables, right, have such dark roots. And even as you were doing your scholarship, basically combing all of the literature for these examples of spiders and what they represent and where they are. I mean, nobody writes in a vacuum. They write in the political landscape that they find themselves situated within. And so, even what we think of as these like innocuous stories usually have very dark and difficult themes of like human conflict.
Uh, s Actually, storytelling in general, I was gonna say fairy tales, but
Mhm.
storytelling in general takes up cultural contradictions.
Mm.
This is why there's never one single meaning that you
Right.
can get from a story because a story will wrestle with contradictions that we have to live with, for better or for worse. We think
Mhm.
of Beauty and the Beast. It's a story about empathy and hostility.
Mhm.
The two ways you can encounter the other by being empathetic, or you can be frightened and scared and terrified and hostile. Uh, Hospitality, as one critic put it, hospitality and hostility come, and we sort of live with things like that, with terms like that, and we have to find not so much a middle road, but we have to find a position somewhere on that spectrum. And I think stories help us work out our values. What is compassion the right answer? Uh, does that work better than hostility or anger or all of these toxic emotions that we've all felt at one time or another? Uh, so yeah, the darkness, it's the human condition.
Mhm.
We have to live with both darkness and light, and everything in between. But stories are. I think of the term chiaroscuro, um, which is applied by film critics to the light and shadows that you get in films, and that kind
Mm.
of that contrast that comes across so vividly in black and white films. That's sort of what I mean. We live in many ways in a black and white world,
Yeah.
and we have to navigate our way through that.
And I think both it's so interesting. I keep coming back to the work that I've been doing recently and the relationship to this literary conversation, but this concept of ambivalence is one of the central features to the psychotherapy that I'm often engaging with my patients in. It's not choosing one or the other. It's learning how to sit with the fact that you can feel two things at the
Yeah,
same time,
right.
even if they feel like they're in conflict. And I think so often in this world we're tasked with having to polarize ourselves and sort of deny one thing in order to embrace another. But I think story allows us to feel conflicting emotions and to ride that roller coaster in maybe a safer way than, overtly confronting our existential demons.
Oh, absolutely. Or, as opposed to reading the newspaper or going on
Right.
social media.
Yes.
Stories are our salvation in that way because everything you said about ambivalence
Mm,
and conflict and, you know, ambiguity. F. Scott
mhm,
Fitzgerald, I think it was Fitzgerald who told us that the sign of an intelligent mind is the ability to hold 2 contradictory
mm,
thoughts in your head at once,
yeah.
and to try to work that out, and again, what you found in your to talk about that, uh, and not, argue with somebody about it, but just to try to figure out this great all these great existential puzzles that we live with.
Mm. And when I think again about, I love the title, by the way, Arachnomania, right? Because when we hear arachno, most people go to phobia. Like that is the sort of the heuristic in our minds. But of course, I have to admit, I'm a lover of spiders. I think they're beautiful. I think they're fascinating. I never kill them in my home.
Oh, hooray, hooray. And I have learned the easy way to get a spider out of the house is just put a glass over it,
Yes.
and it will climb up the glass, and you just need a paper towel or something like that, and you can take it right outdoors.
Yes.
I'm so glad to hear that. And of course, astonishingly, arachnophobia uh, there are no we have allurophobia, cynophobia, this fear of cats and dogs, but none of those words have become part of our normal
Hmm.
discourse. It's only arachnophobia. I think it does take us to a very deep, dark place.
Hmm.
The one that we were talking about that is often associated with women.
And so, as you were doing this work and you were digging deep into all of the mythology, all of the representation, the situating of spider throughout time and throughout space, within the stories that you came across. Obviously, the work could never be completely done. There's no way you could ever,
Right.
come across every spider ever written about. But did you start to notice, I think we've talked about a lot of themes like femininity, but also like deception and some of the more like dark themes that we see a lot. But did you start to notice anything that maybe surprised you? Representations from cultures or from eras that felt like, oh, that seems really out of step with how we usually think of spider in literature.
Oh, I have to say, I think I was surprised by everything in a
Hmm.
strange way. There was nothing that I sort of took for granted. I thought, "Oh, yes, of course." I think what I was shocked by was the number of spiders, the way that they're ubiquitous. Right now, there are probably about 5 or 6 spiders within a few feet of me, and, and in literature, mythology, and, just our culture has a way of being obsessed with these creatures, but at the same time marginalizing them and pretending they don't exist,
Right.
and also forgetting that they are. I mean, in agro, think of the number of insects. Think of where we'd be without spiders. Probably, well, we wouldn't have much to eat for one thing. But but I think what astonished me was, one of the things that happened when I would tell people I was writing about spiders, I often got the ugh, oh, how can you do that? But I also got a kind of, oh yeah, Charlotte's Web.
Mhm, mhm.
And, that was sort of it. That became the reference point. And gee, that can't be very interesting. And so I think what I was astonished by was that, I discovered Anansi and I knew about Anansi, but Grandmother Spider was a figure I was not that familiar with. But that led me then to Sumerian sources and and you discover that these weavers in Egyptian mythology, they're also weavers, and each of those stories is very complicated and has a slightly different take, but
Mhm.
the prevalence of them and the diversity also. I think just as, there are so many different types of spiders and different types of webs, they're reconfigured, in each era and by each culture. And so, I did have this sense, I could just keep writing this book forever because I kept coming up with new examples. But it's also good to stop and say, it's done. And let the next person continue and find all the spiders that I missed.
Well, to that end, I am curious here as we're winding down the hour. I'm curious, what are your hopes for this type of your own narrative, right? Like you endeavored to not just do the scholarship, but then to write this book for public consumption, for folks to sit down and say, my curiosity, my appetite has been whetted. What are you hoping that people walk away with after reading this book?
Oh, I think, I hope to awaken their curiosity about spiders and also to think about, Darwin's entangled bank, that wonderful passage in The Origin of Species where he talks about, just a world. You look at a place in your yard and it's teeming with life and with
Mm.
interactions and all that. And just understanding again, go back to the metaphor of the web, if I may, the interconnectedness and the way that we depend on these creatures. And, we need to be sensitive to the world that's even as, we're living in a planet that is indifferent to human suffering. We have to be attentive to what is happening in our environment, but also to give it a little bit of hope to
Mm.
us because there's so many, we're living in crisis. Every era has its own crises and, terrible things happen. But it seems to me that the next generation is going to have to manage so much more than my generation did, certainly. And I think that sometimes looking at the small and the marginalized and what
Mhm.
appears to be trivial helps us get through the larger problems, the large painful things that are in our environment.
Ugh, I love that. Even what you just said, there is so much depth. There are so many layers. And I have to admit, I just love hearing you talk. You have such a wonderful, like your voice is really rich with awe and wonder. And I feel very inspired by this conversation. It's been an absolute joy getting to talk to you today. And I'm just so grateful for your time.
Oh, thank you. I just feel as if we're so much on the same wavelength, and it's been a pleasure, a joy, really,
Me
just great.
too. Oh,
Thank you.
everybody, of course, everybody. The book is Arachnomania Spiders and the Cultural Work They Do for Us by Dr. Maria Tatar. And everybody listening, I want to thank you as well for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.